Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a concept that's absolutely fascinating and, honestly, well, it's a little chilling. We're looking at the idea that the news you see, read, and hear every single day might not just be reporting reality, it might be actively dictating it. All over the world, governments and massive media ecosystems are locked in this relentless battle to control information and ultimately shape your worldview. So we're going to explore exactly how they do it, where they're doing it, and what it all means for everything we think we know. Okay, let's dive into this. We're going on a global tour across some very distinct media landscapes today, and we're using a recent Dawn newspaper article by journalist Arifa Noor as our guide. She's reviewing this incredibly compelling book called Dictating Reality. We'll cover 5 main areas. First, the battle for news. 2, India's studio command centers. 3, China and Russia's approaches. 4, the Western media critique. And finally, who dictates your reality? Section 1. The battle for news and how authoritarian and autocratic governments are shaping the narrative. So, the book we're exploring through Arifa Noor's review is called Dictating Reality, The Global Battle to Control the News, and it's by Martin Moore and Thomas Colley. The whole overarching theme here is a really deep global concern for the current state of journalism. It looks closely at how national media machines aren't just holding a mirror up to the world, they're actively manipulating it. Just take a second and think about the powerful implication of that title. Dictating reality. It's not just reporting what happened. It's not even just interpreting what happened. To dictate reality means you are authoring it from the top down, and you are forcing a very specific narrative onto the public consciousness.
Let's break down exactly what the authors mean by this. Dictating reality is defined as the process by which national media machines and governments actively control or use the news to create their own specific version of truth. Now, this is a crucial distinction to make. We are way beyond mere journalistic bias here. Bias is just a natural human lean. Everybody has a little bit of it. But dictating reality, that is the active, deliberate, and systematic construction of an entirely alternate worldview, specifically designed to serve state interests. It's a whole different ballgame.
Moving on to Section 2, India's studio command centers and the rise of hyper-nationalistic Godi Media. Now, what's really interesting here is this massive financial lever at play. This takes us to our first geographical stop, India. The Dawn article highlights the book's deep dive into how the state has come to dominate electronic media, especially when covering major events like the 2019 Balakot conflict, the farmers' protests, or the COVID-19 pandemic. Look at that number. A staggering 70% of the Indian media industry's revenue comes directly from advertising, and government spending makes up a really critical, massive chunk of that pie. You can easily see how trading that kind of access and crucial funding for favorable coverage creates a hugely imbalanced relationship. Over time, that dynamic kind of stops being basic cooperation and transitions into straight-up subjugation. The authors make a really profound observation about the end result of this dynamic. They state that the news has been directed from the studio rather than by events on the ground. Think about how wild that shift actually is. Those loud, colorful, highly emotional, and hyper-nationalistic screens have essentially replaced the sober, factual reporting of what's actually happening on the streets. In fact, the book uses a very specific, almost militaristic metaphor to describe this transformation. They say the modern news studio has become a command center, and they actually trace the origins of this shift all the way back to the intense wall-to-wall television coverage of the 2008 Mumbai attacks. Since then, the studio anchor isn't just someone sitting there reading the news to you, they're acting more like generals, commanding a narrative war directly from their desks. All right, Section 3, China and Russia's approaches, and their contrasting strategies for narrative dominance.
Let's shift our global tour over to China and Russia, because the divergence between how these two powers handle information is absolutely fascinating. On one hand, you have China, which has adopted a highly outward-looking strategy. They essentially use Western vocabulary to try and universalize their own version of democratic values, and they aggressively counter any negative news about them on the global stage. They are actively buying up space in foreign publications and building major media infrastructure all across the global south. But then you look at Russia. Particularly since the start of the Ukraine war, Russia has become incredibly inward-looking. Their massive media apparatus is now primarily focused on convincing its own domestic populace about its actions rather than trying to persuade the rest of the world. And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer financial reality of this global narrative war. The disparity is absolutely staggering. The source material estimates that China's media and propaganda spending could be up to $10 billion. $10 billion! Now compare that to Western public diplomacy budgets.
In 2020, the US Voice of America was around $800 million, and the UK's BBC was quoted around $300 million, and that's even before the recent cuts they announced in 2022. To put that into perspective, the scale of China's financial commitment to shaping the narrative is just astronomically higher.
Section 4. The Western Media Critique. This is where we look at a reviewer's perspective on the book's blind spots.
So here's where the Dawn Review by Ira Fanur introduces a really critical lens. Her central argument is that this whole battle to dictate reality, it is absolutely not exclusively a problem of non-Western or authoritarian governments. She argues it's a deeply entrenched issue within Western liberal democracies, too. She points out a major omission in the book concerning the Western press's coverage of the Israel-Palestine conflict, and she lists several specific criticisms. Things like vague headlines that rarely assign agency to Israel for the deaths of Palestinians, a refusal by major outlets to use terms like genocide, and the very real shadow banning occurring on social media platforms. The reviewer argues that this kind of reporting completely shatters the whole myth of freedom and pure objectivity among the heavyweights of the Western press.
And she builds on this critique using a very specific case study, the BBC's coverage of the Al-Ali hospital attack in Gaza. The timeline goes something like this. First, the initial report of the attack comes out. Then, there's the Israeli denial, which labeled the report a modern blood libel. Following that, the BBC faces intense criticism and actually issues an apology. But then, later on, subsequent investigations by the New York Times and Al Jazeera bring new facts to light. The Dawn reviewer points out something super interesting here. She notes that the book uses this entire BBC example merely to highlight their funding crunch and the difficult, gritty work of verification, essentially treating these Western media struggles way more leniently than the systemic, malicious control they describe when looking at non-Western case studies.
Which brings us to the crucial point of the reviewer's critique. She has a profound skepticism about the book's underlying assumption. You see, the book seems to suggest that in liberal democracies, issues like disinformation, or Donald Trump, or highly partisan channels like Fox News, well, they're just societal anomalies, right? Just exceptions born from temporary polarization. But the reviewer counters this by asking, are they really just exceptions, or are top-down pressures dictating reality literally everywhere? She points out that recent reporting on the treatment of Palestinians in captivity wasn't actually new news to anyone who gets their information from outside that traditional Western media bubble.
Finally, Section 5. Who dictates your reality? Time to reflect on your own media ecosystem.
So, we've traveled from the aggressive studio command centers of India to the massive, multi-billion-dollar global infrastructure of China, the inward focus of Russia, and we've examined the critical blind spots identified right within Western media. And I want to leave you with this provocative thought as we wrap up. If every global power, every single political system, and every major media machine is actively battling to dictate the news and shape the narrative from the top down, how much of your own reality is uniquely yours? It's a huge question, and it's one that demands serious, vigilant media literacy from all of us, no matter what country we live in. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning what you read, keep analyzing what you watch, and as always, stay curious.